Hi, everybody. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I want to thank you for joining NFRPP for our July program featuring Bill McKibben and moderator Dan Sosland. Before I turn the program over to Dan, I'd like to urge all of you to look at the Q&A button and submit your questions throughout the program. We have Lee Chinitz aboard. He's monitoring the questions, and he will feed them to Bill and Dan. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dan Sosland, who is the founder and president of the Acadia Center. He spent the past 25 years working on climate and clean energy solutions. One of the first organizations created to address climate solutions, Acadia Center has won numerous awards for its groundbreaking work on climate pathways, energy efficiency, and transforming government to be responsive to climate and equity. Dan is a graduate of Brown University and Cornell Law School, and along with Acadia, the recipient of numerous awards. Dan is a member of the board of directors of the U.S. Climate Action Network. So with that, Dan, the program is yours, and I'll see you later in the program. So everybody enjoy.
Thank you, Rhoda, and thanks to NFRPP for hosting this event, and to Bill for spending some time this evening. We're really lucky to have you. Just a few words about the nation's leading climate commentator and activist. Climate journalist 34 years ago, he published the first general audience book on climate change, The End of Nature. Bill is a founder of 350.org, the first global grassroots campaign on climate, active everywhere in the world except Antarctica. He has opposed the Keystone Pipeline. He's organized and able to involve numerous people, thousands of people in his efforts. He is a winner of the Gandhi Prize. He holds honorary degrees from 20 colleges and universities and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He lives in the mountains near Lake Champlain, Vermont, and is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. And I think perhaps it's really important to note that in everything he does, Bill brings a strong sense of ethics and respect for people and the planet. We're fortunate to have you with us today, Bill, and hear about your latest efforts to channel activism into climate action.
Well, Dan, first of all, what a pleasure to get to be introduced by you, one of the really long-standing stalwarts in this most important of all battles. And your work's meant a lot to me over the years, and it's a real pleasure to get to be on this call with you and with everybody else. I apologize a tiny bit if I'm a little weary. It's been a long 48 hours here in Vermont. Some of you may have been following the news, and I'm outside because on the porch because the sun has finally come out, which is very good news. But the state is in a state of disrepair, and too many of my neighbors out of their homes, bridges out, cities flooded, so on and so forth, all of which brings home powerfully what we're going to talk about tonight. Really, the last couple of weeks have been pretty intense. In some ways, I feel as if this is the week that I started warning people about 35 years ago when I wrote The End of Nature, the first book about climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect. The last 10 days have been epic. We've seen the 4 hottest days we've ever recorded on planet Earth, and the hottest by a substantial margin. We broke the old record for the global average temperature on this planet by about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, which is a staggering amount. That temperature record goes back to 1979, when we cobbled together the set of buoys and satellites and weather stations that provide us with the global average temperature. But the scientists who do the work to extend, paleoclimatologists who look at ice cores and tree rings and the other ways that we can extend the temperature record back, are confident that the last few days have been the hottest days on this planet for at least 125,000 years, since what we call the Eemian period. That means that no human civilization, and really no human that we'd hardly recognize as a human has ever dealt with a planet like this before. The temperature globally averaged has been off the charts, and it's been off the charts in place after place after place. A few nights ago in Algeria, there were several towns where the minimum temperature at night didn't get below 103 degrees. That's the hottest nighttime temperatures we've ever seen in Africa. We've seen a heat wave so extreme in China, in Beijing, that they've opened up bomb shelters that date from the Japanese invasion in 1937 to try and cool people off. The Southwest is sweltering tonight under a heat wave that they say may be the single hottest event that we've ever witnessed in that already hot part of the world. The forecast I just saw for Saturday in Death Valley is for 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which, if that eventuates, will tie the hottest temperature we've ever recorded any place on planet Earth. And with that extraordinary heat has come all the things that you would imagine. We're all by now well aware, almost adjusted to the fact that huge parts of Canada are on fire and that the smoke is drifting across our continent. We're beginning to understand that the salient fact of the 21st century may be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold, thus setting us up for the kind of incredible floods that we see again and again and again. At the moment, southwestern Japan is suffering under the greatest rainfall they've ever observed. Southwestern Japan, Reuters declared a few hours ago in a story, is essentially shut down. And of course, the same is true of much of New England and upstate New York, because the Atlantic, which is far, far hotter than we've ever measured it, maybe the single most amazing spike, statistical spike of all the ones that I've described. The North Atlantic is so hot that moisture is just rolling off it and up the Hudson Valley and on into Vermont at the moment, with rainfall totals of extraordinary size, doing extraordinary damage. None of this, of course, should come as any surprise at all. It's exactly what people like Dan have been telling us will happen for a very long time. There's nothing that we know now about climate change, nothing important or fundamental, that we didn't understand when I wrote that first book back in 1989. There are no surprises. Scientists warned us when this would happen and what would happen. They've been remarkably accurate in their predictions for how fast and how high temperatures would go. We're, and this is, I think, the scary part, still closer to the beginning than the end of this heating process, probable, unless we do everything right. So far, we've raised the temperature a little more than 1.2 degrees Celsius, so we'll call it 2 degrees Fahrenheit. In the next year, the consensus among climatologists is we're very likely to go past, at least temporarily, the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that we set in Paris as the thing to avoid just 8 years ago. But at the moment, we're on a trajectory that'll take us to about 3 degrees Celsius, 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit. If we allow that to happen, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that we're unlikely to have civilizations like the ones we're accustomed to. The amount of violent change and chaotic flux inherent in those numbers is just too large. And if you don't trust me about that, trust perhaps the oil companies. Last month, people uncovered a new cache of documents at Shell Oil, who, like Exxon and the other majors, had been studying climate change back in the 1980s and understood pretty much exactly what was going on. What that one report from Shell said was that with temperature increases like this, we could expect, among other things, enormous waves of refugees around the planet, something we are starting to see. And what those Shell scientists told their executives, the last line of this report was, civilization is a very fragile thing. That should echo in our minds as we think about where we stand right now. The people who have been hit first and hardest by this are the poorest, most vulnerable, and the people who've done the least to cause the problem that we face. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. That's why there's still 8 months after the biggest floods in the history of the planet, or at least of human history in Pakistan, there's still 20 million people relying on humanitarian aid in Pakistan, where millions upon millions of people were displaced from their homes. Vermont will figure out how to deal with this, at least for now. We're still rich enough, but that's not true in many other parts of the world. So along with being an extraordinary practical challenge, this is also the most deep and grave ethical challenge that we've ever faced. All right, we're through the really tough part of this, and we'll move on to the somewhat better news, which is that we know what we need to do about it in a way that we didn't even a few years ago. The most important thing that's happened on our planet, aside from this rapid heating over the last decade, has been the rapid plunge in the price of renewable energy. Solar power, wind power, and the batteries to store that power when the wind drops or the sun goes down have fallen in price by about 90% in that last decade. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And the second cheapest way is to put up a windmill that takes advantage of the fact that the sun heats the earth differentially, creating the breeze that blows those turbines. That's a remarkable moment because it means that we could, if we wanted, move quite rapidly. There's no deep technological or financial obstacle anymore to making rapid progress, and rapid progress is the thing we need. Emphasis on rapid. Climate change is not like other crises that we've faced. It is a timed test. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us 3 years ago that if we wanted to have any chance of meeting those Paris targets, we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030. By my watch, 2030 is 6 years and 5 months away. That's an extraordinary deadline, and it's an almost literal deadline. To meet it, we would have to move all out. But it is possible for us to imagine doing that. In fact, it's possible for us at this moment in our history to imagine something quite dramatic. After 700,000 years of setting things on fire, humans could move past the era of large-scale combustion, and they could do it quickly. Fire has defined the human experience. Darwin said language and fire were the two things that made us different. We were able to cook food, so we got the big brain. We were able to move north and south away from the equator. The anthropologists think that standing around the campfire for millennia, eons, has helped give us the social bonds that mark our species. When we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil in the Industrial Revolution, it produced modernity. All in all, a good thing. But the downside to combustion has become extraordinary. The biggest of those downsides is the climate crisis that I've just described. It's the biggest thing humans have ever done by orders of magnitude, the most dangerous thing, a truly existential crisis for our species and many others. But it's not the only problem with combustion. We know now from good work by public health researchers around the world, and the last big meta-studies came out about a year ago, that 9 million people a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, those particulates that lodge in your lungs and kill you. 9 million people is 1 death in 5 on this planet. If you've been to Delhi or Shanghai in recent years, those numbers are, it's possible to understand where they come from, but it's not just people in those places. There are hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma every year in this country that derive from breathing the byproducts of the combustion of coal and oil and gas. And in the last year, we've been reminded of the third big reason it would be nice to end combustion as a habit. When you rely on a fuel source that is concentrated in a few places, the people who control those places end up with more power than they deserve. In our country, the biggest oil and gas barons were the Koch brothers, who used their winnings to degrade and deform our democracy. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron is Vladimir Putin, and he's used his ready cash to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. It would be very nice to move to a regime where we relied instead on fuel, sun and wind, that's available everywhere on Earth. That is not to say that renewable energy comes without problems. You have to mine lithium and cobalt, for instance, to make it possible. But we should be able to make the mining of those things more humane and environmentally sound. And in any event, it happens on a scale dwarfed by the scale of mining for fossil fuel. That's because if you're going after lithium, you're going to use it in something, a battery, say, where it lasts a quarter century. If you go mine coal, what do you do with it? You set it on fire, so you have to go get some more tomorrow. So we have the biggest problem we've ever faced. We have a cogent and possible solution to that problem, not a perfect one, but we don't live in a perfect world. The question is, why are we not pursuing it with more vigor? We're pursuing it with some vigor. The Inflation Reduction Act finally gave some money to start doing all of this, but we're not doing it at anything like the pace that we need to make those targets that the physicists, indeed that physics, have set for us. And the reason for that is, well, some of it's inertia, always a force in human affairs, but much of it is vested interest. Remember what I told you a minute ago about the difference between lithium and coal, gas, and oil. If you keep that in your mind, you'll begin to understand the problem here. You can make money putting up solar panels and wind turbines, but you can't make Exxon, Shell, Chevron kind of money. That's because once you've got the solar panel up on your roof, the sun delivers your energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. If you're Exxon, who spent the last 100 years getting rich by making you pay for a new delivery of energy every week or month, that's the dumbest business model of all time. And they have done everything in their power to make sure that it does not come to pass. As I said before, we now know that these companies knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s. When I was writing my book, when Jim Hansen was producing his first papers, on and on and on, they knew from their scientists what was going on. They believed those scientists. Exxon began building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was in the offing. What they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they embarked on this 30-year program of deception and denial and disinformation that kept us locked in a completely sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate, remember, that both sides knew the answer to at the start, just one of them was willing to lie. And that lie turned into the most consequential lie in human history because it cost us the one thing that we desperately needed, time. That's why we have to work in 6 years, not 36 years, to do what we have to do. And it means that, and that, by the way, that denial goes on, though now it mostly takes the form of delay, efforts to slow things down, to maintain that business model a while longer. What that means in practice, I think, is that simply, well, I'll put more of this on myself. I made a big mistake for 10 or 15 years after first engaging this project, And that mistake was in thinking that we needed mostly to win the argument. So I kept writing books and operating symposiums and writing articles and so on and so forth. It began to dawn on me at some point around the turn of the century that we had conclusively won the argument. The science was robust. There was no question about what was happening. Won the argument, we were just losing the fight, because the fight was not actually about data and reason and evidence. The fight was about what fights are usually about, money and power. And the other side in this fight had sufficient money and hence sufficient political power to lose the argument but maintain their business model indefinitely into the future. That's when we began casting about for some ways to build power of our own. Lacking billions of dollars, we seized on the other possible currency, the currency of movements, where people's passion, spirit, creativity counts, where sometimes people have to spend their bodies and go to jail. 350.org was the first vessel that we built for this. I started it with 7 college students about 15 years ago, and it was the first iteration of a global grassroots climate campaign. We've organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on Earth except North Korea. We even have done some in the Antarctic, it must be said. That work's been wonderful. We got to kind of spearhead the fight against the Keystone Pipeline, the first big defeat for big oil, and the progenitor of 100 other fights against pipelines and frack wells and oil terminals. We also launched the fossil fuel divestment campaign to persuade institutions to sell their stock in these companies. It's now at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have done so, including most of the world's important universities, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, University of California, University of Michigan, on and on and on down a very long list. That's been very important, effective. Shell Oil, in its annual report a few years ago, described it as a material risk to their business, which made us happy because Shell's business is a material risk to life on planet Earth. The best thing that happened from that divestment campaign, though, was that it grew a hardy crop of activists. Young people from those universities, when they graduated, wanted to keep on. They formed what's called the Sunrise Movement, and that brought us the Green New Deal, and the work on that is the reason that we got anything, this Inflation Reduction Act, out of the last Congress. So young people have been absolutely at the center of this fight. The Sunrise Movement, but also, of course, you know about the much younger people, junior high and high school students, exemplified by Greta Thunberg. She's one of my favorite people on the planet. There are very few people I like working with more. It was great fun to write her last week with congratulations about graduating from high school. She'd be the first to say there are 10,000 Gretas around the planet, great youth leaders, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on climate strike in September of 2019 before the pandemic hit. But I heard one too many people say to me, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems, which strikes me as ignoble, but it also strikes me as impractical. By themselves, young people, for all their energy and idealism and intelligence, lack the structural power to make change we need on the scale that's required in the short time that we have. We do not have time for them to grow up and become senators and CEOs and whatever else. That's why we started casting around for who did have that kind of structural power, which is why we started this thing called Third Act about 18 months ago. It aims to organize people over the age of 60. I don't know if there's any other people, old people like me on this call or not, but if you can tell your parents and grandparents in any event, if you're not. It's proven to be useful because there are a lot of us, 70 million people over the age of 60 in the US, 10,000 more every day, which is more than the number of people born in this country every day. We punch above our weight politically because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the country's financial assets. About 70% belong to the silent generation and the boomers. That means that if you want to push around Washington or Wall Street or your state capital, it'd be a good idea to have some people with hairlines like mine. The conventional political science idea was that people become more conservative as they age. That's one of the reasons people haven't really tried doing this kind of organizing with older people for the most part. But I don't think that turns out to be true of this cohort, because if you're in your third act now, your 60s, 70s, 80s, it means that your first act was in that period of remarkable social and political and cultural transformation, the height of the civil rights movement, the moment when we began taking women seriously, the first Earth Day, when 20 million Americans marched in the streets, and within a year we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. If you have any doubt about how important those years were, look at what the Supreme Court went after last year in their rampage. The Voting Rights Act of 65, the Gun Control Act of 68, Clean Air Act of 71, and Roe v. Wade 1973. It's been really fun to organize with those people for the last 18 months, and we've built a large and fast-growing operation with chapters now in most of the states of the Union, also chapters devoted to what people did during their lives. Third Act healthcare, Third Act educators, Third Act creatives, on and on and on. It's been great fun, and people have figured out all kinds of good things to do. One of our big targets this year has been the 4 banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, that are the 4 biggest funders for the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. In March, we had a day of action across the country where in 100 cities we shut down those banks with sit-ins and protests of various kinds. I was in Washington, D.C., where we had a huge crowd, and we shut down the banks by sitting in. We're a little old for sprawling on the sidewalk for hours at a time. So instead, we deployed hundreds of rocking chairs, and in them we sat, and that was the close of business for the day at those banks. The Times the next day styled it the Rocking Chair Rebellion. At any rate, it's really good to be able to back up young people in this work and try to get some things done. And I guess really that's where I'm going to end this talk, by saying that we very much need you outside your comfort zone. I have no doubt that everybody on this call has done something or another to help with this fight over the years, but I also have no doubt that it's been insufficient. All of our efforts have been. That's why the temperature's through the roof and the capital of my state's underwater tonight. The planet is a mile outside its comfort zone. So we need to be outside ours some too. That'll mean different things for different people. I'm routinely surprised by the number of people who tell me that it's on their bucket list to get arrested for a good cause. We're happy to help if that's on yours, but it's not the be all and the end all. There's lots of work to be done in all kinds of ways. The only caution I would make as I end is don't try to do that work by yourself. The American hyper-individualistic ideal traps us into often a sort of certain limited way of thinking. So we fixate on what car we should drive or what our diet should be or whatever. Those things are fine to worry about, but we're past the point where we're going to solve the math of climate change one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make some actual change to the political and economic ground rules. Even if we do that, Dan nor I can promise you that we're going to win this fight. We don't know. We are behind. There is enormous physical momentum in these systems. We're definitely not going to stop global warming. We may be able to stop it short of the point where it wrecks our civilizations. That's going to be a close call, and it's going to require us to move more nimbly, more powerfully than we've moved at any time, at least since the moment that we took on fascism in Europe in the middle of the last century and transformed our economy in a matter of years in order to do so. This is the same scale of challenge. We don't need to kill or be killed to deal with it, but we do need to bring to it the same kind of intensity and focus and willingness to change. Remember that it is a timed test. Dr. King used to end his talks by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, which I think meant this may take a while, but we're going to win, which was a comforting thought. The arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. If we don't win soon, we won't win ever. And so that explains, at least for me, the urgency behind this work. If the last week hasn't brought home that urgency to people, then I think nothing ever will. But I hope that at least for some of you it has, and that you're now ready to jump in ways that you haven't before. Many, many thanks in advance for doing that. Many thanks to you all for letting me rattle on tonight, and especially to Daniel for a lifetime of important work on this front.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for those remarks. You pulled so many important ideas together in a very eloquent and clear way. I just wanted to ask a couple questions before we do the Q&A from the audience. Picking up on the theme and the sobering information you've provided about the impacts that are already occurring. You're in a state right now that's considered almost a sanctuary of a model, small town life, and yet, as you said, Montpelier is underwater. People are being evacuated by helicopter from their towns. It's happening all over. Heat waves in the south. My question really has to do. You've been in this field 35 years, maybe longer, before you started writing, and it has to do with optimism and hope. And I wanted to just take a moment to point out just a few headlines just from this past week. Because it's not just the reporting of the information, it's how it's being reported. So Washington Post headline, why a sudden surge of broken heat, as you referred to, but they use the phrase as scaring scientists. The New Yorker this week has a piece on what to do with climate emotions. And the subtitle is, what is the right degree of panic? There's a level of emotion entering the discourse that, is somewhat new. But what really strikes me is if you go on the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, there are articles about something called climate anxiety, and there's 4 pages of ways to test yourself if you have it. I'm leading up to this following point. There was a survey done just 2 years ago, 10,000 people from 16 to 25, that age group, about climate, and 50% polled had feelings of, quote, sadness, anxiety, anger, powerlessness, helplessness, and guilt, and 45% were frightened for the future. So all of this happening now, and you're sitting in a place where you're experiencing it in real time. Do you have any thoughts about what is the balance between optimism and hope, and how would you define progress in the next couple of years? Because people need to work towards solutions and feel that they're going to accomplish something.
Yep. These are just it's a really important question. I mean, I get emails every week from young people saying, do you think it's okay to have children? Which is a new thing for our species, I think, to encounter, and no person should have to think about that. And it's a stark reminder of our failure that millions of people are starting to ask questions like that. On the one hand, a certain amount of climate anxiety is a sort of mark of actual sound adjustment to the world around us, because there is an awful lot to be anxious about. If you were not anxious, then that's who one should unleash the Mayo Clinic on, because that indicates some kind of deep-seated problem, it seems to me. On the other hand, too much anxiety is obviously crippling and paralyzing, and keeps you from working. I've found, and it's especially young people that I worry about the most here, that what they feel above all is abandoned, left to their own devices somehow to deal with this crisis. Their sense maybe that the boomers among us used up a lot of the good things in the world and then kind of left them to deal with all the problems that come with it. And the surest way to at least help with that a little bit is to not abandon people. I'll tell you a story. We took on this work around banks at Third Act because the US chapter of Fridays for the Future, which is Greta's group, asked, they came to us and said, look, we want to take on these banks because it's ridiculous that they keep funneling money to the fossil fuel industry, and it is ridiculous. But most of us are too young to have bank accounts. We can't get credit cards. Can you help us? We were like, yeah, we'd like to help you. The first big demonstration we had around these banks was in Boston. And there were hundreds of high school students there because there's always hundreds of high school students. And they're somewhat sprier. So they were out in front of the march, But at the back, there was a big group of us from Third Act with a banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels." And every young person who saw it started laughing, and it was a laughter of relief that there were other people there, at least in solidarity with them. Solidarity is an underrated human, I don't know, emotion's not quite the right word, but that feeling that you have people who are helping you shoulder this burden is a powerful one, and it's what we desperately need to be doing. It's good for us in other ways too, probably. I mean, one of the features of modern American high consumer life is for 75 years, we really haven't needed neighbors for much of anything. But that's not going to be true for the next 75 years. Let me tell you, in Vermont tonight, people are exquisitely dependent on their neighbors. And so growing a sense of solidarity is a great help in many, many ways, I think.
Well, thanks for that. I want to make sure we have enough time for the audience Q&A. So I think I'll turn it over to Lee. Lee, do we have some questions?
We do. We have actually quite a few. So I'm going to take them a little bit out of order. And I don't know, Bill, you can, I guess, take as long as you want, but we've got about 25 minutes left, a little bit less, and something like 6 questions to get. So here's the first one from Richard Grant. Would it be correct to believe that we're in a race between the scaling up of climate action and the occurrence of the climate tipping point? What's your take on how that scaling up is progressing?
Well, I think it's exactly the right metaphor. I was just writing today that it's the greatest race in human history with the greatest stakes. And it really is a race. The only interesting question around is pace. Obviously, we're eventually going to run the world on sun and wind because it's incredibly cheap. But if it takes us 75 years or 40 years or at this point 25 years to get there, the world that we run on sun and wind is going to be a broken world. The job is to make it happen fast enough to matter. And that's why we need endless amounts of action to try and catalyze really that chemical reaction to make this thing work more speedily than it otherwise would. That's what activism amounts to at the moment, pressure to build up the pace of that change.
So let's, I guess, let's go with the action question then from Sid Madison. Many of us are asking / begging President Biden to declare a climate emergency. Where do you stand on the issue with the knowledge that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, will not get us far enough? And also, he says, thanks for all you do, by the way.
Look, we should declare a climate emergency because there is a climate emergency. And I think it would actually be clarifying for everybody to just out front say that. And the president's probably the best guy to say it. I'll tell you who's been trying really hard, and it's interesting to think about. We don't pay as much attention in this country to the UN or to the Secretary General of the UN as people do elsewhere in the world. But Antonio Guterres has been truly amazing on this for the last 3 or 4 years. He's supposed to be the world's chief diplomat, but he has long since abandoned diplomatic language, and he is speaking the plainest truths in the plainest language. Addressing the oil industry earlier this year, he said, "Your core product is our core problem." He said, "Any expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure is economic and moral madness at this point." Those are the kind of phrases that we really need coming from our leaders to help us understand the depth and dimension of the crisis in which we find ourselves. So I hope we can persuade Biden to do something like that. Biden has claimed to having done more for the climate than any president before him, a low bar, but one that he easily passed with the IRA. On the other hand, he's continued to do unproductive things like approve the Willow Oil project in Alaska, vast offshore oil leases, things he promised he wouldn't do during his last campaign. And he now stands ready to either approve or reject a string of LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast that will lock us into using fracked gas for a very long time in the future in a lot of parts of the world. It would be a grave mistake.
Okay, so couple here, a little bit technical. So Michael Hartman writes a question. I'm going to maybe summarize a little bit. He's referencing the equilibrium climate sensitivity. He says that, in the past, people thought it might be low, 1.5 or 2 degrees, but more recent science is looking like with feedback, it might be closer to 4 degrees. Since it's going to be hotter and faster, what are your thoughts about looking at other means to cool the planet, including solar radiation management techniques, I guess sort of geoengineering?
Yeah. I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker in the fall that you can go find about this, because solar radiation management, as they call it, the euphemism for injecting huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere in order to block incoming sunlight, is becoming more and more, I don't want to use the word legitimate, but there's more and more people in positions of power talking about it. It is, on the one hand, insane. We've filled the atmosphere with one chemical, and in order to counteract it, now we're going to fill it with another. We're going to block incoming sunlight. I mean, we're a planet whose, among other things, biology runs on sunlight. These are, these are horrible solutions. On the other hand, we may be reaching points where we have very little choice at some point. If we make it through the next 6 years and haven't really done what we're supposed to do in order to, say, building out renewable energy, and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is continuing to increase at this pace, then those kind of break the glass solutions are going to become, sadly, more plausible. If we ever decide to do them, it should be regarded as a great, great admission of defeat, and it should be regarded in the most somber terms, and it should come only, and I mean only, with the most radical commitments to ongoing decarbonization as the price for doing it. The oil industry would like to use this and a dozen other schemes to allow them to maintain their business model farther into the future. They'd like to keep burning stuff and throwing carbon in the atmosphere and then throwing some sulfur at it to compensate. The other reason that we should be very wary of solar radiation management is because it does nothing at all about the other twin problem that accompanies climate change, which is the rapid acidification of the world's oceans. Even if CO2 had no effect at all on temperature, we would desperately want to stop it because we're quickly changing the chemistry of the planet's seawater, which is the place where most biology takes place. I mean, if we were honest, we'd call our planet ocean, not Earth. And the fact that we're monkeying with its most base, changing its pH, the fact that if you stick a strip of pH paper in the ocean, it comes out a different color than it would have when we were young, is a enormous indictment on its own account.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of then their, business models, things like that. Here's one from Paul Rosenwasser, I think. So it's a question about green hydrogen. So many parts of it, but at any rate, basically, does green hydrogen have a future in climate management solutions? Various ideas about whether it can be used for generating, energy or heating homes, that sort of thing. So anyway, green hydrogen.
Yeah. So first of all, let's be clear that any other form of hydrogen is a very bad idea. And it's other forms of hydrogen that the fossil fuel industry is most interested in. They want to do gray hydrogen, or basically take natural gas and turn it into hydrogen. Bad idea. Green hydrogen, where you take sunlight or wind power and turn it into hydrogen as a kind of storage medium to allow you to use it for other things, is not as bad an idea. But it's my guess is that it's not going to be the key play here because of its cost. The fact that sun and wind are so incredibly cheap is driving the technological driving the technology really fast. So, a decade ago, there was a lot of talk about hydrogen, for instance, as an automobile fuel. But that's clearly silly because it's much, much cheaper to just use electricity and not do anything with it. There'll be use cases for hydrogen, especially in kind of time shifting, so that you can take excess renewable energy from the afternoon and store it in this way. And there may be places on Earth, Japan, Korea, that lack the available land mass to do as much renewable energy as they need on their own. And so, using the outback of Australia to produce hydrogen that you transport there in the form of ammonia or something may make sense. But truthfully, the biggest single imperative is sun, wind, batteries.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Now some sort of, not directly related, but okay. Here's one around investing in renewable energy funds, but just sort of your thoughts on that, because the comment is there's a lot of greenwashing going on. So how can you figure out, which funds are actually doing what they say they're doing?
So I'm a bad fund advisor. I can tell you what not to do more than I'm good on divestment, but not so good on investment.
Okay.
But greenwashing is a very big problem. It's now a highly developed corporate art, and we're learning that huge categories of things are just bogus. There was a big report last week saying that something like 80% of all the carbon credits and offsets that people have bought over the years are just junk. They're not actually doing much at all. Again, the thing if you invest in, and it is figuring out how to do this straight ahead energy transition. And when I say invest in, one of the best things to do economically here, one of the things that would be most helpful, is to figure out how to invest in building renewable energy projects that are community controlled. The reason that that's important is that it dramatically lessens the opposition to siting solar farms or wind turbines or things if there's a serious return coming to the local community from those things. And so the places that have done the best with this, Denmark, Germany, things, have very intentionally pursued that path.
Okay, there's a question here. I had really wanted to ask you a question, and I see one of my own, and I've got a question that came in here that I'm going to read to you, and then before you answer it, I'm just going to tack my question on because I think they're related. So this question from Ronald Mertens, it's interesting. It says, Bill noted that it's an imbalance of power between those who know the problem and want to act ASAP, and those vested interests who don't want any change. To me, it's the same as sitting in the backseat of a car with the driver racing to a brick wall and refusing to listen to our screams to stop. Here in Ontario, Canada, our premier is very poorly educated conservative and has no concept of what climate heating even is. The creation of a groundswell of public pressure to force action is obvious, but how? Any advice? I know you talked about some stuff, but what I wanted to ask you about, and I think it's related, is, you know, it's just in right at the same time as this session, I was reading this book, I don't know if you know this, by Mariana Mazzucato, called The Big Con. It's all about the consulting industry. And I was just reading it, and then all of a sudden it, you know, this one section pops up. And it says, you know, since the publication of the first IPCC report in 1990, been public knowledge that the climate crisis represents the greatest, most existential challenge of our time. But for 30 years, concerted and collective action to confront it was resisted by governments and business who believed that the market driven by profit and shareholder value would provide solutions instead. Then, you know, says clearly that didn't work. And in the face of that, governments and business actors whose growth depends on the continued extraction and consumption of fossil fuels have doubled down, promising citizens and international observers that they would do better by enlisting the services of market actors paraded as credible experts, the consulting industry, and championing the consulting industry in this way. Scientific evidence and the voice of actual experts are crowded out. You know, her basic point in this book is that, you know, consultants tend to do that even for companies, not just for governments. They essentially, you know, remove the expertise, or, you know, it ends up removing expertise from places where it's really needed. And I guess I see these kind of things as related. So kind of wondering what you think about all of that.
Absolutely. This is huge, and this goes to this question of greenwashing. I mean, because that's essentially what you're describing. And there happily is some good work being done about this. One of the most effective and interesting campaigns underway at the moment is a campaign from a group called Clean Creatives that tries to take on the advertising and PR industries, and sort of by extension consulting, and shame them into, and they've had some real success. In part because these businesses are so exquisitely dependent on endlessly recruiting talent from, you know, the group of young people who are most concerned about climate change and who really do not want to spend their lives being expensive fronts for absurd, you know, the sort of classic examples being things like, if you'd watched Exxon's commercials for the last 10 years, you might have well have concluded that they were an algae company that happened to have a few oil wells on the side, you know, when in truth they never put more than 1 or 2% of their R&D budget into anything except fossil fuel. And so it's really important to keep illuminating and highlighting that. And then it's really important, and this goes to the other half of that question, to keep building those movements to make change happen. Because our political system always defaults to the status quo, to the powers that be, unless it is pushed. When it's pushed, we have a chance. A way to think about this that I find useful is, I think the two great technological inventions of the 20th century were the solar panel and the nonviolent social movement, which was invented, a technology, an unlikely technology, invented by Gandhi and Dr. King and suffragettes and a million other people whose names we don't know. But what they discovered was that there were ways for the small and many to prevail over the mighty and the few, but it really does take the many, not everyone, but a lot of people. The classic example, and I referred to it earlier, is the first Earth Day in 1970. On that day, 20 million Americans, by the best estimate, were out in the streets. That was roughly 10% of the US population in 1970. And it turns out 10% is enough. Within the next few years, Richard Nixon, no friend of the environment, we know from the Nixon White House tapes that he thought environmentalists were a bunch of dirty hippies who, you know, he had nothing but scorn for, but he could read the polls. And so we have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, which are still the things that we rely on to try and conduct environmental policy in this country. If we got 20 million Americans out tomorrow demanding action on climate change, that would be a big deal. And even in our fractured and kind of chaotic political system, it might well be enough to spur really profound levels of action.
So I can see Rhoda is hovering here. We're coming up near the end of your time. This has been really interesting, clearly, because the questions keep rolling in. So we're not going to make it through all of them, unfortunately. I guess I'm going to end with one, just because it's, for me, such a nice closing the circle. Is the first thing I ever said directly to you after the New England Aquarium talk that you gave. I cornered you in the hall to ask you exactly the same question that Arnold Rubin is asking here, which is, what about nuclear energy?
So nuclear energy is relatively low in carbon, which is good. It comes with some other problems that we know about, and we're reminded of when, we have to worry that the Russians are going to blow up the, plant in Ukraine or whatever. But that's not, I think, the real thing. The real problem at the moment is just that it's highly, highly expensive and pretty slow to build. It has to compete against the economics of sun and wind. There is hope that a kind of another generation of small modular reactors will come along in the not too distant future. And if it does, and if they're cheap and safe, then it may rewrite the story some. But that's not going to happen in the next 6 years in powerful ways. And at any rate, the great advantage of nuclear power, that it's dispatchable easily, is pretty much being overcome by the fact that batteries are getting so cheap so fast. So I guess one way to think about it, if you really like nuclear power, is to remind yourself that we could rely on the fact that there's a very large nuclear reactor hanging in the sky, and at a very, very safe and economical distance. And we should celebrate that fact and enjoy using it. I sometimes slip back into my role as a sometime Methodist Sunday school teacher and just say, it's very nice to imagine for once using energy from heaven, not energy from hell. And I think if we could make that our mantra over the next few years, we might make some rapid progress here. All of you, such thanks for giving me this opportunity. Lee, Daniel, so many thanks for your work, and to everybody on this call tonight, many, many thanks for being engaged in these questions. I got to say, it's been a great help for me to have an hour of not thinking about rising river levels, failing dams, so on and so forth. I'm going to go back to that now, but in better spirits and convinced that there'll be lots of people joining our efforts at Third Act to try and together make as much good trouble as we possibly can in short order. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, Dan. Dan, is there anything we've left on the table that we would like to just share with the audience?
Well, I think there's a lot we could go on, but I think Bill needs to get back to helping his neighbors. That's a great thought that you gave us to leave the evening with.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, Dan, and thank you, Lee. And we've got a lot to do.